When we talk about election hacking, it's really important to get the words and the concept right. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Niloofar Howe. She is a cybersecurity investor and entrepreneur. Welcome, Nilo.
Great to be here with you, Tonya.
So in what kind of companies do you invest?
Well, I look for a couple things. First of all, I'm looking for companies that have a new approach to whatever tech problem they're trying to solve. It's a real problem that customers are having and their approach is differentiated in the market. The team matters so much to me. It's all about execution at the end of the day. So, important problem, novel solution, and A+ team is what I look for.
A hot topic on everyone's mind, and anyone where you have a particular interest in the election hacking, how would you define what it means to hack an election? Have hackers flipped actual votes or vote counts, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I actually believe it's really important to get the words right when we're talking about this, because when people say the election was hacked, it implies that the votes that were cast were changed, or illegal votes were cast by outside influence. And that simply didn't happen in the 2016 election. It's not that we're not worried about it, but the election itself wasn't hacked. Now, was there an influence campaign that may have caused people to change their minds or not show up to vote? Absolutely. That's the piece we really need to worry about. But our election hasn't been hacked. And despite that, by the way, we are even more vigilant today about election infrastructure security than we were back in 2016. We've learned so much from that election. The awareness has kicked up. So the way both state, local, as well as the federal government work is very different today than it was in 2016.
So what did we learn from the 2016 election?
Well, we learned that our election system needs to be protected. So one of the first things that Secretary Johnson did was declare it as critical infrastructure. That was a really important move, along with our financial systems, our banking systems, our utility systems. Our election infrastructure is now critical infrastructure, and it's getting the attention that it deserves. Secondly, back in 2016, there was no cooperation really between state and local governments and the federal government. In fact, the states pretty much viewed the election process as something they owned, and they didn't want the federal government overreaching. So when Secretary Johnson reached out to the states and said, hey, do you guys want some help? There's stuff going on out there. All 50 states said, no, please stay out of our business. Today, all 50 states are cooperating with DHS, and they're using DHS services to make sure that the election is safe. Now, there's also an information sharing and analysis center, so that all 50 states are sharing information about what they're seeing real time. And importantly, at the federal level, there's interagency cooperation now. So DHS, DOD, law enforcement, the intelligence community are working together. So at the first sign that something's actually happening in the election, there will be a rapid response and remediation. So we're just in a completely different position today when it comes to the election itself. By the way, the other thing to keep in mind is there's 175,000 precincts out there. These machines are not interconnected. So if someone gets into one precinct and manages to somehow disrupt that system, they're not going to be able to then get into the entire election system. It's not like an enterprise network when once you get in, you can sort of move laterally across the network. That distributed posture actually works to our advantage. Most of these the voting machines themselves are also air-gapped. So it's just, in the scheme of things, of course we need to worry about it, but it is not the biggest concern today.
You've actually said that the influencer campaign is a more strategic move from anybody that would try to mess up our system and hack our voting process. So if foreign actors are running an influence campaign, how does that differ from attack ads or mudslinging that candidates have run against each other in the past? I mean, since really the dawn of time.
Well, the issue here is that we have foreign governments who've basically weaponized information, right? And they're using it to undermine our democracy very purposefully. So take what Russia is doing. Russia cannot take on the United States from an economic perspective. Russia cannot take on the United States from a military perspective. Remember, its economy is about the size of Italy's, and every demographic trend is working against it. What Russia can do is take on our democracy and cause us to lose faith in its legitimacy through the internet, through cyberspace. Something they could never do in the kinetic world, and they can't do with a direct assault on us. So what they're doing very systematically is, unlike the mudslinging, which tends to be very personal and related to a particular campaign, they're actually trying to make us lose faith in the integrity of the pillars we rely on for our democracy. So our national security system, our intelligence community, our election process, which is sacred to all Americans. The fairness and transparency of that process matters so much to us. And even the judicial system, they're actually attacking the judicial system. So once the citizens in America lose faith in rule of law, lose faith in the election process, and lose faith in their federal government, what do we have left? That's the long play that they're going after. They're turning us against each other. And we're a democracy that believes in free speech. So we're actually not set up to fight this. And we're going to have to change how we operate. It's the only way they can take us on. And right now we're playing into their playbook, and we need to rise above it.
What are we aware? Are our political officials aware that there is an influencer campaign? And if so, what are they doing about this?
Well, yes, everyone's aware of it at this point. And, the entire intelligence community has come out unanimously, and they're pretty much in agreement about what did or did not happen during the elections, what is or is not happening with respect to fake news. And I think there's a couple things. So 5 years ago, if the social media platforms had announced that they were going to start filtering content and trying to root out certain kinds of speech that's not allowed, political speech, et cetera, fake news, I think people would have risen up and said, you can't do that. That's not your job. First Amendment. Today, we realize that everybody has an obligation to protect this democracy and to make sure that things like fake news are not proliferating, and that foreign governments aren't allowed to subvert our election laws and get in and influence us. Now, we have to come together, and this has to be a public-private partnership in order to be able to do it, because the platforms they're using are not public infrastructure. These are private companies. So we need to come up with the right partnership, working together to have the right regulations in place to minimize the impact of this. We also, frankly, to be honest, we need leadership. We need leaders who can rise above the political fray and not sort of go to their 5 talking points, but really say, look, guys, here's what's happening to our democracy. Let's stand up as Americans and not let it happen. By the way, the last piece of this is there have been organizations that have been doing media literacy training around the world. So, for example, in Ukraine, teaching Ukrainians how to source facts. We need to have media literacy in this country, because for a long time, we assumed that what we read was true. We were used to the era of, Walter Cronkite and New York Times, and what they wrote was essentially fact. That's not true anymore. Information's been democratized, and technology, enables people to pose as things they aren't. So we need to also teach our children how to source facts and how to be savvy with respect to media.
So is it possible for everyday Americans to identify social media bots? I mean, what should we be looking for?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So I think if we're going to rely on the individual citizens to fight this and not on the social media platforms, it's going to be incredibly difficult. The latest statistic I read is that the bots that are on the political extremes are put out 25 to 30, for example, on Twitter, put out 25 to 30 times as many tweets as anything that's in the center. So the extremes are absolutely overwhelming the center. The platforms have to do their bit to root out the bots and the trolls that are getting in there and really artificially changing the conversation.
So how is artificial intelligence and potentially facial recognition being used by hackers to either disrupt our election tampering or influencing people?
So I'd love to sit here and say, by the way, that, oh my God, they're using the coolest technology in the world. They're out there on the cutting edge, and this is such a hard fight. The reality is, when you look at what's happening, you don't need to use sophisticated techniques to get in and cause damage. And by the way, weaponizing information, it's not just creating fake news. You can weaponize real information. So the DNC hack, for example, when they released the emails there was nothing made up in those emails, but that actually probably had an influence on people who read those emails and saw what was actually going on and some of the tactics that were being used. So you can weaponize real information. And unfortunately, phishing attacks, stealing credentials, exposing and manipulating human beings continues to be the number one attack vector, whether we're talking about the elections or we're talking about cybersecurity in general from an enterprise perspective.
Let's talk about the platforms. You said what we as individuals, maybe should be aware of, but what should the platforms be doing? What should Twitter be doing, or Facebook? What should they be doing to help, filter out some of, the quote unquote fake news?
Well, so just to back up for a second, I do think, again, this is a public-private partnership. So the federal government has a responsibility, and I think the media platforms have a responsibility. There have been, I think, a half dozen different bills that have been contemplated in Congress. Nothing is moving forward because there's so much, again, internal bickering going on. At the Hill, the political leadership is not raising its sights and deciding that this is important enough to address yet, and to come up with a unified view of how we deal with what is fundamentally a technology problem, the influence campaign. The internet is being subverted for something that is not positive, and it's not good. So I don't want to take responsibility away from the folks on the Hill to work together. And by the way, because the internet is global and there's no boundaries on it, it has to be an international effort. Our democracy is not the only democracy that's under attack. 18 different elections around the world have been, attacked one way or another, whether it's directly or through an influence campaign. So from my perspective, all the democracies need to get together. Anyone who cares about transparency and truth and fairness needs to get together and come up with a global solution, define what the norms in cyberspace need to be with respect to this kind of activity. And that is on us. I mean, that's on the political process to do. That's not something we can or should delegate to the social media platforms. Now, those platforms do have an obligation as well. Look, they are changing the way we work and live. They're creating a tremendous amount of wealth, and they can create a tremendous amount of disruption. And I think they've seen it. So they have an obligation to make sure that their platforms aren't being subverted. And we're seeing now, Facebook has taken on a bunch of activities. They're now talking about the things they're doing. Well, after the midterms, we'll get a better sense of whether or not, what they're doing has been successful or not. But I don't think anyone is really sitting back and saying, not our problem. I think 5 years ago they were. But today I think everyone acknowledges that there's there's a joint obligation here to work together.
Okay. So are there any steps that individuals can take to guard against election hacking or influencing in the midterms?
Well, so know the sources that you're going to. I mean, I don't think hacking the election infrastructure is what we should be concerned about. I think Americans should be confident that if they choose to show up and vote, and remember, in the last election, half the voting population didn't show up to vote. But if they choose to show up and vote and perform this duty they have as Americans living in a democracy, their vote will be counted. And if anything happens to disrupt that, we are amazingly good at dealing with that kind of disruption and destruction. If someone tampers with a system, we're going to figure it out. If someone destroys a system, that doesn't bother us. The piece that we have a really hard time with, again, is this influence campaign. And if I'm going to get philosophical for a second, human beings, our brain was wired to survive, in the wild, right? The jungle attack. And we have all these biases that are built into our brain that help us survive a lion attacking us in the jungle, but don't really help us navigate today's world. We need to understand that as humans, we gravitate toward information that makes us feel good, about our point of view and our perspective. And people should start challenging that and really trying to understand every side of it. When you see, when someone makes a statement or you read a statement, source it. Make sure that you go to multiple sources to make sure it's true if it's an important piece of information. there's just a bigger obligation. It's a little bit more difficult today to ferret out what's true and what's not, but it's not impossible.
You're right. It absolutely isn't. And I think this is an ongoing conversation that we're going to continue to have as we understand more and try to educate ourselves more on what's happening on the internet and getting the real news, which you're providing. Thank you so much, Niloofar, Razi, Howe. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to find out more about your work in cybersecurity or investing in your entrepreneurship, how can they do that?
Well, my Twitter handle is @Niloofar That's the best way to reach me.
Sounds good. Thanks again for joining us. And if you guys want to find me and more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe go to my website. It's tonyahall.net. And I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.